range that this summary encompasses, if we could? Date, ending date, beginning date.
Certainly,
This is just part of the admissibility here. Ms. Blake, the witness is being handed that. It sounds like provisionally there's no objection, but if we could identify, and it'll be helpful for the record too, just the date that this encompasses. Date range.
Yes. Agent, are you able to tell us the date range that this would cover?
This exhibit covers a date range of January 2019 through, I believe it is August of 2019.
And is there a reason that that is what the time frame within this exhibit?
Yes, the pertinent portions of the iCloud for today's testimony exist within that specific time frame.
And through the investigation, did you learn when Chad and Lori first met?
Yes.
What did you learn in relation to that?
They met on October 26th, 2018.
And so this exhibit would begin several months after their first meeting?
Yes, it does. There are communications that reference the time frame of their meeting in 2018, but those communications are dated July of 2019.
And through the investigation, did you learn the last known day that Tylee Ryan was seen?
Yes.
And what was that day?
The last known date that Tylee Ryan was seen was September 8th of 2019.
Did you learn the last day JJ Vallow was seen?
Yes, the last day that JJ Vallow was seen was September 22nd of 2019.
And did you also learn the day that Tammy Daybell was declared dead?
Yes, Tammy Daybell was declared dead on October 19th of 2019.
And through the investigation, did you learn when Chad and Lori got married?
Yes, they were married in Hawaii on November 5th of 2019.
And when you became involved in the investigation initially, JJ and Tylee were still missing, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Your Honor, it's my understanding then the exhibit would be stipulated to?
All right, with those dates determined, Mr. Pryor, any objection?
Judge, it's not stipulated to, but there is no objection to the exhibit.
Okay, well then, without objection, States Exhibit 183 is admitted. The court noting the actual exhibit will be the PowerPoint presentation file on a digital drive. The court has a courtesy copy as well as counsel, and the witness is referring to printed versions that are derived from that PowerPoint presentation.
And Your Honor, I guess just to ensure the record is clear as well, the iCloud accounts have been stipulated to that this content's pulled from.
Okay,
So.
and I will note that as well. Thank you.
And that is correct, Judge. These have been stipulated as part of the record.
Okay,
And Your Honor, with that, the state would ask permission to publish.
yes, you may publish.
Agent Hart, when you created this exhibit, did you pull over the content from these iCloud accounts?
I did.
So do some of these contain potential spelling errors, things of that nature?
Yes. Most of what we'll see today are text messages. And so the Cellbrite software arranges them in a reverse chronological order and assigns each text message a line number. Associated with that is a date and a time for the text, and then who it was to or from, and then the actual content of the text. And so I cut and pasted the content of the text exactly as it appears in the iCloud account.
Thank you. And with that, would you go ahead and read these messages into the record?
Yes. This sheet is from the SMS section of Lori for Style at iCloud.com. Line number 2585, January 23rd, 2019, 5:18 p.m. Text from Lori Vallow to Audrey Baratario. Hi, Audrey. This is Lori. I would love to talk to you sometime. Text me or call me. I'm excited to be able to talk to you about what we both know. Line number 2584.
Judge, could we approach?
Yes. All right, Ms. Blake, if you'd like to continue with direct, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent Hart, if you could go ahead and continue reading those into the record.
Yes. Line number 2584, January.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point on the basis that this is cumulative. There's a record that's already been established with the exhibit. And to just require the officer to read the remainder is cumulative in my opinion.
All right, response from the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state's position is it is not cumulative. While the state recognizes it is an exhibit, it's also a summary exhibit that we heard testimony from the agent that this would aid in his testimony today, that he believes it would aid the jurors in understanding. While it is what's on the screen, so long as it's read as to what's appearing on the screen, the state's position is in no way is this cumulative evidence. So we would ask that the judge overrule that objection and allow us to move forward with testimony.
And Judge, briefly in response is that the exhibit is what it is, and it's clear for the jury to look at that and read that. It doesn't necessitate the prosecutor to go line by line over a massive exhibit.
I am going to sustain the objection in that I would find it be somewhat, well, it is cumulative to have a written version of all of the messages and then to simply have a witness read through all of the written messages when they're already being published and the jurors are all capable of reading them as well. I'll sustain that in that I just don't want to have the entire thing read into the record. I don't know that that's necessary, but if you want to have any time or assurance to make sure the jurors have read the messages and direct the witness to any of the specific messages that are contained in there, certainly you can go there, Ms. Blake, but just the wholesale reading of all the messages, I do find the objection is sustained.
Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, looking at the first one there, appears to be a message from Lori sent to Audrey.
That's correct.
Can you tell us if you learned through the investigation, who Audrey Baratario is?
Audrey Baratario was a friend and associate of Chad Daybell.
And did you learn through the investigation how she came to be in contact with Lori?
Chad Daybell introduced her to Lori Vallow.
And when we look at that first message, is there something about that initially caught your attention?
Yes, it's the line where Lori indicates to Audrey that she's excited to be able to talk about what we both know.
And then did you look at that in conjunction with the response from Audrey to Lori?
Yes, Audrey indicates states that she guesses Lori has talked to Chad. And so it's clear from this particular text string that there's a reference by Lori Vallow to Audrey Baratario about what Lori, Audrey, and Chad Daybell know.
And Your Honor, may I ask that the witness be handed a laser pointer if we have one available?
Yes, I do think we have one.
Thank you. And Agent Hart, if at any point that's helpful.
Okay.
That. And then was there some significance to these other messages in relation to those first messages?
Yes, mainly in the fourth line where it says by Lori to Audrey that she thinks it's fun to talk to someone who knows what's really going on. Again, a reference to something between the three of them.
And again, this was in January of 2019.
Correct.
If we move to the next slide, I'm going to pause to give the jurors a chance to look through that.
Yes.
And Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, we have the name Melanie Boudreau. Did you learn through the investigation who she is?
Yes, she is Lori Vallow's niece.
And there's a reference in that first email to someone named Brandon. Do you know who Brandon is?
Yes, these are text messages, not emails, but Brandon is Melanie's husband or soon to be ex-husband. They were in the process of separating and getting a divorce.
And there's also the name Al. Do you know who Al would be referencing?
Only by the content of the text. I have never met or spoken with Allie Bloomer or her husband.
And what caught your attention about these particular messages?
These messages and then the next two slides are a continuation of this text string, demonstrate several significant things that are relevant to this investigation.
And in the very last message, it appears to be a message from Chad to Lori.
Correct.
And what did that appear to be an indication Chad was going to do?
So during the investigation,
Objection, Judge, that was going to call for speculation.
Overruled.
during the investigation, we came to know that Chad Daybell purported to have the ability to assign an individual as being either dark or light, and he would give them a score. And Lori Vallow and others would seek Chad's visions as it related to assigning people as being either dark or light. And so this is one of the first references we see in the iCloud account where Lori Vallow is seeking from Chad Daybell, or Chad Daybell rather offers that he will check Allie Bloomer and her husband, meaning he will see what their scores are.
And then looking at that first message, it references that Brandon is making me promise not to have you or Al around my house or kids. Do you know who that Al is?
Yes, that's Alex Cox, Lori's brother.
And then you had already indicated this next slide is a continuation. I'm just going to pause to give the jurors a chance to read through that. And when you looked at these messages, was there anything on these that stood out to you?
Yes, primarily in line 3000, where Chad Daybell responds back approximately 8 minutes later, giving Lori Vallow these scores. He assigns Allie Bloomer as being 4.1 dark, and her cop husband is a 3 dark. And so those are coming from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow in reference to this issue that's come up with Melanie Boudreau.
And if we look at the line 2996, is Lori passing that information along?
Yes, and this is a pattern that we see repeatedly, that Lori Vallow would solicit Chad Daybell's advice or visions. Chad Daybell would respond, and then Lori Vallow would disseminate that out to whoever was making that inquiry.
And if we move to the next slide, I believe you indicated this is also a continuation of that conversation.
Correct.
I'm just going to pause here to give the jurors a moment to look through that.
Yes.
When we look at these messages, if we start with the new one, there's a reference to checking for recording devices. Did anything about that catch your attention?
Yes.
And then did it catch your attention in reference to the following messages?
It
Or is it
did.
related?
It did. So subsequent to seeking those scores on Allie Bloomer and her husband, Lori Vallow then makes a request to Chad Daybell to clear Melanie Boudreau's house and also check it for recording devices. And so Chad Daybell responds that he'll do that and that he's having to break down some dark entries Brandon created, and that he detects 3 listening devices. And that answer is then passed on directly from Lori Vallow to Melanie Boudreau, referencing Chad Daybell as Melanie Boudreau's father, and then verbatim passes on that message. So to me, this establishes once again,
Judge, I'm going to object. It's calling for speculation.
I'll overrule that. You can answer.
it establishes that the individuals within this group look to Chad Daybell as the supposed visionary who will give them these types of information.
And in these messages, when the request is made, Chad responds. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm turning to the next slide. I'm again going to pause to allow the jurors a moment to look through that.
Very well.
Agent Hart, when we look at the date on this message, can you read the date?
I can, July 13th of 2019.
Do you know when Charles Vallow was killed?
He was killed on July 11th of 2019.
So just 2 days prior to this message.
Correct.
During this time, was Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes.
Do you know who Adam, Leah, well, I'll stop there. Do you know who Adam is?
Yes.
And who is that?
Chad Daybell's son-in-law.
And do you know who Leah is?
Chad Daybell's daughter.
And do you know who Joe is?
Joe is also Chad Daybell's son-in-law.
What is it, outside of the date, what else about this message drew your attention?
There were a couple of things that I think are significant in this message. The first is this line where Chad Daybell says, "I feel she will be gone by then," which is a reference to the pending death of Tammy Daybell.
Judge, objection. That calls for speculation.
I'll strike that last part of the answers.
you.
Insufficient foundation.
Based on your investigation, who did you believe the she to be?
Tammy Daybell.
It calls for speculation. I'll renew my objection, Judge.
And Your Honor, I think based on his investigation, I'm asking who he believed this message to be
Judge, could
referencing.
we approach, please?
No, it's overruled, Mr. Pryor. Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Who did you believe the her to be?
Tammy Daybell.
Or I said her, but the word is actually she, the pronoun used, correct?
Correct.
Looking at the second to the last sentence, could you explain if there was anything about that that drew your attention?
Yes, it helps tie in the line, "I feel she will be gone by then." So Chad Daybell tells Lori Vallow that the Lord has hinted to him that he might not get to be with Lori Vallow until after this graduation ceremony takes place on July 23rd, and asks Lori Vallow to, quote, "Please ask about that."
If we turn to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read that. Agent Hart, looking at the date on this one, how many days ago had Charles been killed?
3 days prior.
And again, Tammy Daybell's still alive?
Yes.
Do you know, or did you learn through the investigation who Lily would be referencing?
Yes, Lily is another name for Lori Vallow.
Was there something about this that caught your attention?
There are two things about this communication that caught my attention.
Could you tell me what those were?
The first is the reference to joining Chad Daybell in the shower. They were physically, Lori Vallow was in Arizona, Chad Daybell was in Idaho at the time of this message. So there are repeated references to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell having the ability to connect on a spiritual plane and be together spiritually. So this is just one example of that, but it's pertinent because it happens repeatedly and it could be easily confused that they were actually physically present together, which they were not. So that was the first thing that stood out.
And what was the next thing?
The next thing is the last line of Chad Daybell's text to Lori Vallow, where he says he loves her so immensely that the whole universe knows it, and very soon the people on this little blue globe will know it too, which demonstrates that their relationship was clandestine or secret at this point, and that at some future date, the relationship between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow would be divulged by Chad Daybell.
And then moving to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors time to read that. Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, there is the name James and a name Elena referenced. Did you see those in this message?
Yes.
Were you able to determine through the investigation who James is referencing?
Yes, James is Chad Daybell.
And were you able to determine who Elena is referencing?
Yes, Elena is Lori Vallow.
And again, the date on these messages is how many days after Charles Vallow was killed?
This is now 3 days after he was killed.
What is it about these particular messages that drew your attention?
Well, the James and Elena communications are very significant, and we see them first in the email section of the iCloud, starting on July 8th, continuing through July 9th, and through much of July. Chad Daybell is the author of these portions of a narrative or a history that chronicles Chad Daybell's meeting Lori Vallow and how their relationship developed. He refers to himself as James in this and to Lori Vallow as Elena, but in fact, this is autobiographical. It is based in fact. We verified the facts of the story as being correct and accurate to real events. And so in this, we have a description from Chad Daybell as to how he met Lori, and particularly several important events that occurred early on in their relationship.
And in this first one, there's an indication now on with the story. Were there other segments that came before this next message?
Yes, and it's very voluminous. And so what we're seeing here were portions that were sent via text message by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow. But as I said, on July 8th is the first instance we see of a very lengthy narrative written by Chad Daybell sent to Lori Vallow via email.
And again, during this time, Tammy Daybell is still alive?
She is.
In that second message, there's the indication they would both attend the same event in mid-November. Were you able to determine through the investigation if that occurred?
Yes, so that's a reference to November 15th through the 17th of 2018. So while this message was sent via text on July 14th of 2019, the narrative contained in the message is talking about a time period between the end of October and prior to November 15th through the 17th of 2018.
And the last sentence of that text, was there something that stood out there?
I think the entire text is pertinent, as well as that last sentence. In the middle, Chad Daybell states in this narrative that he and Lori Vallow had been married before, and references some past time with the Savior when he lived in Jerusalem. And Elena, or Lori, had been his beloved spouse and best friend. In the final line, he says that relationship was now meant to continue in this lifetime. So looking at this history, Chad is saying that after he met Lori Vallow, he knew that their relationship was now meant to continue in this lifetime, with the assertion that they had been married in a previous lifetime.
And again, you talked about, while this message is sent in July of 2019, that it's referencing events from 2018.
That's correct. Chad Daybell met Lori Vallow on October 26th of 2018 at a Preparing a People conference in St. George, Utah. That's chronicled in this history. In between their first meeting, there was a 3-week time period before they would physically meet again in Mesa, Arizona, November 15th through the 17th, 2018, at another Preparing a People conference. So the time period being referenced by Chad Daybell in this communication is that time period from the end of October 2018 until they meet again physically in November of 2018.
And when this is written, Charles and Tammy are still alive.
That is correct.
We go to the next one. And again, I'm going to pause here to let the jurors read it. And this message again has the date of July 14th of 2019, correct?
Yes, it does.
And could you talk a little bit about what it is about this message that caught your attention?
What caught my attention is that this is the first time Chad Daybell introduces to Lori Vallow the concept that they had lived as human beings at another time in the past, that they had been married to each other in the past, and that they were meant to be married again in this present time and complete these important missions together.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point, and I voir dire a native objection.
Oh, well, there's no pending question at this time. So if there was an objection, Mr. Pryor, this wasn't timely.
And again, Agent Hart, when we're seeing the James and Elena references and this story being drafted, it is referencing back to events that would have happened previously.
Yes, he is referencing events and phone conversations that took place between the end of October 2018 and just prior to November 15th through the 17th of 2018.
And again, when we're looking at this, Charles has been killed just 3 days before this message.
That's correct.
And in 2018, when this story's referencing back to 2018, Charles and Tammy were still alive.
Yes, Charles and Tammy were still alive. Lori Vallow was married to Charles Vallow, and Chad Daybell was married to Tammy Daybell during this time period that he's describing.
Judge, I'm going to object on response, or actually, Judge, I'll withdraw at this point.
All right. Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
There's also a reference in there, the line starting with "he was ecstatic." Could you read that sentence in there?
He was ecstatic that she was receiving confirmation of these things as well.
Did that indicate anything to you?
Yes, in the first sentence, Chad writes that he tried to delicately describe their connection with one another and was in fact delighted when Lori Vallow believed him. And so this is Chad Daybell introducing these concepts of he and Lori having been married in a previous life.
And then later on, we see that she appeared to be getting confirmation of what Chad was telling her.
Correct.
There's also reference in there to physical desires.
Yes.
With the talk of physical desires, making love, was there anything about those that caught your attention?
Well, it demonstrated the attraction of Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow instantly upon their meeting in October of 2018.
If we move to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. When we look at these messages, they are also dated July 14th of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was it about these messages that caught your attention?
This is a communication by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow, seeking an opportunity to be with her in person and using a camp out and a potential speaking assignment as a ruse to be able to leave Rexburg and go and be with Lori Vallow.
And there's a reference there in the first message, whether she is still here or not. Based on your investigation, did you determine who that she would have been referencing?
Tammy Daybell.
And in the James and Elena, we saw some reference to some kind of physical attraction. And then in these, what stood out is Chad and Lori are actually going to meet up in person here.
Yes, the investigation had revealed they had already met at several different times with travel to different places to be together for periods of 2 or 3 days. And in fact, we were able to verify that Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow did meet and were together during that July 24th through 26th timeframe that's referenced in the communication.
And July 24th to 26th, Tammy Daybell was still alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. And again, these are a continuation of text messages from July 14th of 2019.
Correct.
And again, just 3 days after Charles Vallow's been killed.
Yes.
What about these messages drew your attention?
There was a lot of what we call sexting content in the iCloud that I examined. I included these communications as just a very, very small example that this was in fact a sexual affair. It was not an emotional affair or a spiritual affair. It's very clear that it's a physical sexual affair between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
And moving to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. And if we look at these, can you indicate the date on these messages for the record?
July 15th of 2019.
So these are moving to the next day from the previous messages.
Correct.
What is it about these particular messages that caught your attention?
This is an example of how Lori Vallow sought to manipulate Chad Daybell in the immediate aftermath of Charles Vallow's death.
And in that text from Chad to Lori, could you read the last line?
He says, "You are my wonderful best friend that I can't live without."
And again, during this time, Tammy Daybell is still alive.
Correct.
And the manipulation that you're indicating is Lori's response there. Could you read the first line?
Yes, she replies, and yet you are so sad, missing you.
Referencing back to his message to her that he couldn't live without her.
Correct. Chad Daybell tells Lori Vallow how much he loves her and he can't live without her. And her response to that is, and yet you are, in fact, living without me. So sad.
And moving to the next slide, again, I will pause to allow the jurors to read. And could you indicate the date on these messages for the record?
July 18th of 2019.
What about these messages stood out to you?
Well, this is a series of texts that occupies this slide and the next 3 slides, all regarding the same subject, and that is Lori Vallow has just found out that she is not the beneficiary to Charles Vallow's $1 million life insurance policy.
And she's telling Chad that.
Correct.
Going to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And you indicated this is a continuation of the previous slide, correct?
Correct, as well as the next 2 slides.
In looking at this particular slide, there's a reference to bringing down the Gadiantons, especially Brandon.
Yes.
Through the investigation, did you determine who that Brandon would be that is being referenced?
That is Brandon Boudreau, Melanie Boudreau's soon-to-be ex-husband.
Through your investigation, did you learn anything in relation to Brandon and an investigation involving him?
Yes.
What did you learn?
What could you clarify? What did we learn about?
Yes, sorry. Did you learn anything about an incident being investigated by the Gilbert Police Department involving Brandon as a victim?
Yes.
And what did you learn regarding that?
On November 2nd of 2019, as Brandon Boudreau was pulling in his driveway of his home in Arizona, an individual shot at him with a rifle, narrowly missing him.
And you said November 2nd. Is it possible it was October 2nd?
I'm sorry, you are correct. It is October 2nd. Excuse me.
And that was October 2nd of 2019.
Correct.
Do you know, did the reference bringing down the Gadiantons mean anything, or did you learn what that was referencing?
I learned that that is a reference. The name Gadianton has to do with a group of people that's referenced in a book of scripture called the Book of Mormon. The Gadiantons were robbers and thieves. And so the word Gadianton is indicative of someone who is a thief or a robber or a bad individual.
And as Lori's telling Chad that she's no longer the beneficiary, can you read the last text into the record?
Yes, that's a text from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow. It says, it will be interesting if it got changed after he had 2 bullets in his chest.
And going to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, I think you indicated this is also a continuation from the previous 2 slides. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Were there some additional references on this particular slide that stood out to you, or particular statements?
Yes, primarily the last line.
And what was it about that that stood out to you?
That's a text from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell. And so she had found out that the beneficiary for the life insurance policy had been changed in March of 2019. And then she says, so it was probably Ned before we got rid of him. Ned is the name of the supposed dark entity that Chad Daybell had assigned to Charles Vallow.
And then there's a reference there before we got rid of him, correct?
Correct.
Did you learn what the $4,000 a month from SS was in reference to through the investigation?
Yes, that's a reference to money that would still be coming to Lori Vallow through Social Security for her children, primarily for JJ.
And then if we move to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read.
Very well.
And when we look at this slide, can you read the date on these messages into the record?
Yes, these 5 messages are all from July 21st of 2019.
We've talked about who Ned is. Through the investigation, did you learn who Rhonda is that's being referenced?
Yes, Rhonda is the name assigned to the dark spirit or dark entity that Chad Daybell assigned to Kay Woodcock.
Judge, I'm going to object on foundation.
Sustained.
Agent Hart, as part of your investigation, did you review other documents?
Many, yes,
Did you review other reports?
yes,
Did you discuss this matter with other investigators?
yes,
And based on your review in this case, did you determine who Rhonda was referencing
yes.
and who?
And I'm going to renew my objection, Judge. You can talk about all the reports you want, but unless they get into specifics, telling me how he came to that conclusion, which documents, when, where, and time, it's still not sufficient foundation.
For purposes of this direct, I do find there's sufficient foundation. I'll overrule the objection. You can cross on that, of course, Mr. Pryor, when it's your chance for cross-examination.
Who did you determine Rhonda to be referencing?
Kay Woodcock, who is Charles Vallow's sister.
Now, there's references in some of these messages as well to working on someone. Through your review of the iCloud and messages, did you determine anything in relation to those working on, or did that stand out to you?
Yes, this is a phrase that we see repeatedly in the iCloud, and it actually has a dual meaning. When they're referencing somebody who Chad Daybell has determined to have a dark spirit or a dark entity working on them, has a negative connotation. When it's someone who's determined to be light or good, then working on them is an uplifting or a building connotation.
Agent Hart, as we've reviewed some of these messages that were around or shortly after Charles' death, we're seeing some of them. In your review of the messages, did you ever see any signs of grief or sorrow from Lori Vallow?
No,
Did you ever see any signs of grief or sorrow from Chad Daybell?
none.
If we go to the next slide again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And would you read the date of this message into the record?
July 21st of 2019.
And we've talked about James and Elena before, and this story, again, it references a prior period of time than when the message was being sent. Is that correct?
Yes, so at this point in this narrative, the dates are, this would be November 15th of 2018.
And we saw a previous slide dealing with that same time frame. Is that correct?
The previous slides were actually talking about that period of time between the end of October and prior to November 15th of 2018. This particular story talks about when Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow are now physically together in Mesa, Arizona on November 15th of 2018.
And through the investigation, did you learn if Chad Daybell was in fact in Arizona in November of 2018?
Yes, we verified that he was present on that specific date. We verified that he spoke at a Preparing a People conference there during those dates of the 15th through the 17th of November 2018, and verified that he was physically present at other locations as well.
And outside of the continuation of the James and Elena, were there specific things in this message that drew your attention?
Yes.
What were those?
Primarily that there was a plan that had been revealed or communicated to Chad that wasn't entirely clear to him yet, but it included them, meaning Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, being together at the present time.
So specifically, the plan was being revealed to Chad.
Correct.
And there's a reference of Chad and Lori having a mission together.
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm again going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, these messages were also sent on July 21st of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
In looking at these particular messages, was there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, they're very insightful in that Chad, in his own words, is explaining the feelings he had for Lori Vallow within 3 weeks of meeting her, that they had progressed through this relationship. They had finally found their best friend that they could trust and confide in.
And again, the period of time this message is referencing, both Lori and Chad were married to other people.
Correct.
And Lori Vallow responded to this message. Can you read her response?
She loves it.
And there's the reference in there to the 3 weeks. And would this have been, was the meeting in November about 3 weeks after Chad and Lori met in real life?
Yes, that's verified.
Moving to the next message, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And would you read the date of this message into the record?
This is also July 21st of 2019.
And this is a continuation of the James and Elena story being written.
Yes.
Are you aware of which time period this message is referencing?
This is referencing a specific date of November 16th, 2019, or excuse me, 2018.
And was there something about this particular part of the story that drew your attention?
There were multiple things that drew my attention to this that I believe are pertinent to the investigation.
Can we go through those one by one?
Sure.
What is the first one that drew your attention?
So the first is that Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow went to an LDS temple that has been verified. They attended the temple in Gilbert, Arizona on November 16th of 2018 together. And that they then participated in a ceremony that is a proxy ceremony for marrying people who have already been deceased.
And again, that was verified that they were at that temple together.
Yes.
And they reference the proceeding. After that, there's an indication in here, if you can read from the James and Elena knew.
James and Elena knew that they were now sealed as husband and wife for eternity.
Did that line stick out to you?
Yes, this is Chad Daybell's writing stating that when he and Lori participated in this proxy ceremony, that somehow through that, they had become once again married for eternity.
And then if we go to the last sentence starting with "they knew," would you read that into the record?
Yes. They knew they had just begun a new journey together that was eternal and never ending.
Was there something about that particular line that caught your attention?
Yes, this is the beginning of their relationship and continuation of that relationship in the coming months that encapsulate the time period of this investigation and the crimes that are alleged.
And if we go to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And these messages were also exchanged on July 21st of 2019, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And in looking at these messages, were there things that caught your attention?
Yes, two things primarily.
And can you walk us through those?
Yes. The first is that Lori Vallow responds to those prior clips that Chad wrote about James and Elena, saying, "It's making me so happy to read about our life," which is a verification that this is an autobiographical or factual account.
And then what is the next thing?
The next is the line from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell, which says, "I love you more than ever. I can't wait to be with you forever. I'm begging father and mother. That's my job tonight." To which Chad Daybell responds, "I will be right beside you, begging just as much. I need you desperately."
And what, if anything, did that indicate to you about Chad and Lori's relationship?
That they had a clear plan to be with each other, to be together forever, and that they were both begging God for that to happen.
And again, when these messages are being exchanged, is Tammy Daybell still alive?
She is.
In your review of these iCloud accounts, was there ever any indication of Chad planning on getting a divorce?
None.
Ever any indication of Chad planning on getting separated?
No.
Moving to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And could you please read the date of these messages into the record?
July 22nd of 2019.
You just talked about the previous slide indicating a plan to be together.
Correct.
What is it about these particular messages that stood out to you?
Again, there are a couple of different things that stood out as relevant. The first is the text from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow referencing going to see a movie with Garth, who is his son. He then says, missing you desperately, but so excited to be with you. If you'll recall from a prior slide, there's a plan July 24th through the 26th for Chad and Lori to be meeting in person. And so the first line is a reference to their in-person meeting that's coming up.
And then looking at Lori's response, is there something in there that drew your attention?
Very much. She said, I love you. You will enjoy the scenery. Looks like Kauai a lot. And then responds with another text saying, hopefully we will be there someday soon together.
So there's a reference to Kauai.
Yes.
Do you know where Kauai is located?
Yes, it's in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands.
What's Chad's response to that?
Chad's response is significant. He says, that is the plan, exclamation point, and my greatest desire.
And then we talked about Kauai being in Hawaii. Looking at Chad's final sentence there of the last message, could you read that into the record?
Yes. I look forward to being on a tropical island with you.
I asked you earlier if you knew when Chad and Lori got married. Do you recall when that was?
November 5th of 2019.
Do you know where they got married?
I do.
Where was that?
Kauai.
Do you know where Chad and Lori relocated eventually after getting married?
Kauai.
During the time those messages are being exchanged, was JJ Vallow still alive?
He was.
Was Tylee Ryan still alive?
She was.
Was Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes, she was.
Moving to the next slide. Again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you read the date these messages were sent into the record?
July 26th of 2019.
Looking at these messages, did certain parts of them catch your attention?
Very much so, yes.
And what is it about them that caught your attention, if you can walk us through that?
Well, the time frame is important. So these messages were sent as Chad Daybell was returning home from having spent 2 or 3 days from the 24th through the 26th with Lori Vallow. So he references that he's just gotten home back to his home in Rexburg and that he had a splendid time with her. And then he follows up with a narrative or sentiment that he believes or feels that he's a grown-up version of Harry Potter who has to live with the Dudleys in a little space under the stairs. And then every few weeks he gets to escape and have amazing adventures with his goddess lover. The part that to me is most significant is the final sentiment where he says, then I have to return to my place under the stairs, feeling trapped. But I sense permanent freedom is coming, exclamation point.
And you indicated he just returned from the weekend or from the time with Lori, correct?
Yes, these messages were sent upon his return back to his home in Rexburg.
So he's referencing being back home with his family. He feels trapped.
Correct.
Looking at the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, if you can read the date these messages were sent into the record.
July 28th of 2019.
What about these messages stood out to you?
There's a couple of things. This is in reference, just for context, to a trip that Lori Vallow was planning to take with Melanie Boudreau and Alex Cox to Southern California.
And in these, we see a message from Chad to Lori about no privacy here to hardly text. Do you happen to know where Chad would have been located at that time?
Judge objection foundation.
Sustain.
With these messages, was there any through your investigation, was there any indication that Chad Daybell was going on a trip?
No,
The indication was Lori Vallow was going on a trip.
correct.
So based on your investigation, Chad wasn't leaving his home.
Correct.
Judge objection. This is leading.
Well, it was, but it's already been asked and answered.
Then we see, looking at that third message on there, the text from Lori to Chad, is there something about that drew your attention?
Yes, this is approximately 2 weeks after Lori Vallow's husband, Charles Vallow, has been killed. She is now free from her marriage. Chad Daybell is not free from his marriage. And she says, I need a distraction while I'm waiting for you. And he replies, absolutely, I think you'll have a fun time.
And turning to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to look at these. And
Council, could I have a quick sidebar? right, thank you, counsel. That last exhibit, I'll ask if the state would redact certain information off of that, and I'll permit time to do that. In addition, the court had previously discussed with counsel our scheduling for today, given that it's Friday and we've been through a long week. I'm going to suggest we break for the day. We have advised the jurors previously we might be stopping early today. Ms. Blake, is this a good time for us to break until Monday?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Any objections from the defense?
No objection, Judge. Thank you.
All right, that will conclude evidence for this week. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at this time, I do want to again admonish you, especially over this long weekend, please do not discuss the evidence you've heard here with anyone else, including amongst yourselves. You can only do that after deliberations begin. Please don't follow the case or investigate the case in any way so that you can remain objective and decide this case only on the facts and evidence you've seen here in court. With that admonishment then, thank you so much for your attentiveness this week. We will commence again 8:30 Monday with additional evidence in the state's case in chief. With that in mind then, we'll go ahead and conclude for the week.
All right, please.
All right, thank you, everyone. We'll be in recess.
Witness the lies,
I didn't lie to you on that polygraph, I promise.
the cover-ups,
I could see his brain.
the moments they confessed,
I grabbed one of the kitchen knives. I killed him.
outrageous police interrogations.
I know, I forgot the head. I wanted the head.
You have to see to believe.
Oh my God.
Law and Crime Interrogations. Subscribe today.